All right, everybody, it is now Saturday. Most of the dads with 17 kids, 3 wives, and 14 jobs who can only play for 15 minutes a day are finally jumping into Season 4, Loot Reborn of Diablo 4. And what that means is that you're probably coming across all of the items that are now in the game, a bunch of really cool affixes, a bunch of new different systems, and I basically wanted to give you like a very quick checklist breakdown of what you need to know about how all of this works together. This is not going to be an exhaustive list, but I'm going to cover rare items, legendary items, unique items, tempering, masterworking, how do you get to the pit, how do you get the stuff, and what you should be looking out for on a very general guideline. Alrighty, so let's start off with the easiest question. What do you do with rare items nowadays? Rare items in Diablo 4 are now purely for progression. You're going to be getting these in the early world tiers 1 and 2, and you're going to very quickly outgrow them. They can only have 2 affixes, whereas a legendary piece of gear, and let me show you a base one, can have 3 affixes. That means that a rare piece of gear will never be on the same par as legendary gear. That might feel bad to you. What happened? I thought we could get cool stuff. If you were to add an aspect to this, so imprinting it at the occultist, it will not gain a 3rd affix. So then what's the point of the ding dang things? Well, one, you can go sell it for 27,000 gold. There's a huge economy of gold right now where everything has gold sync. So I end up selling the vast majority of the stuff as opposed to salvaging. But the entire purpose of them is that you don't need to pick them up anymore and you don't need to look at them anymore. If you have an inventory full of legendary gear, that means that every piece that is orange will be strictly better than any piece of rare gear. You can go ahead and just leave them on the ground. But if you want to pick them up, they have drastically increased how much you get from salvaging rare pieces of gear. So they're like a little bit of an extra treat to make sure that you always have resources without having to worry about throwing away legendary pieces of gear, which typically sell for more gold or may be more valuable for you. Speaking about a legendary piece of gear, there was a massive rework to how the Codex of Power actually functions in the game. Before, you would just run a couple different dungeons, unlock some aspects, and they would always be really low powered, and you generally would outlevel them and need to fill up your inventory with legendary pieces of gear. Now though, if you find an aspect, so this one is of Ultimate Shadow, it's a mid-roll on the aspect. If you go salvage this piece of gear, it will be added permanently to your Codex of Power, and every single aspect now exists inside of that list. Going into your collections page and then your Codex of Power, you'll be able to see every single one of the aspects and what rank you have of it. When we talk about ranks, we're literally just talking about the relative power of it. So for accelerating aspect, I actually have a perfect rolled version of it, of a 25 out of 25%. That means I have a 16th rank of it. But what it turns out is that aspects could drop within a range of 16 values, and unlocking the strongest version of it will leave it here forever. You can re-imprint this permanently. You never lose out on it. It's not going to go away. So, okay, perfect. We now know that rare pieces of gear are just there if you want to sell them or salvage them. All we care about is our legendary pieces of gear. As you continue to level up, you're going to get stronger and stronger versions of these. The aspects will also get stronger, and you'll be able to get perfect rolled aspects once you walk into World Tier 4. If you're killing a monster that is at least level 95, that means that every single piece of gear that you will drop will always be item power 925. That is the highest item power in the game. So once you basically hit level 95, anything that you kill can always drop an upgraded version of piece of gear for you. It's worth your time to pick up every single legendary and unique. And let's just say you found a really good legendary piece of gear and you see that it has this cool star on it. What is a star? A star is a greater affix. Whenever an item generates with a greater affix, it will come with 1, 2, or 3 greater affixes on a legendary piece of gear. Or on a unique piece of gear, it can get up to 4, since they have 4 affixes normally. A greater affix says that it will always be the maximum roll, and it will be 50% stronger than the normal value would be. So here we have an asterisk next to our intelligence. That means that my weapon has the highest total value of intelligence that I can possibly have before you begin masterworking it. So if I were to look at this random wand that I have that has no greater affixes, you'll see that intelligence still has a range, 76 to 90 on a one-handed item. But instead, because this is a greater affix, it has a maximum roll plus 50%. And that means that with 3 greater affixes on a legendary piece of gear, the stats that you can get on these pieces gets pretty ridiculous pretty quickly. But now that we've hit that part, what if I wanted a different affix on my piece of gear? What if I didn't want greater intelligence and I instead wanted a greater damage or greater maximum life? Sadly, if we go over to the occultist and reroll this piece of gear, you will lose out on the greater affix, and you can't roll into a greater affix. You instead have to generate the item, you have to find it as a piece of loot with the greater affixes on it. What that means is that there is a universe where you might find a piece of gear with 3 greater affixes that aren't particularly valuable to you. Now, that's not a completely dead piece of gear. It's not like you should just throw this thing away. Remember, in Diablo 4, you can now actively trade items, and a lot of people are looking for greater affix gear because we also can brick items, which we'll talk about in a quick second. Because of that, it may be worth your while to find some of the third-party sites that allow for trading. Tradery.com or Diablo.trade are ones that people are using most typically. And in these places, you can go find somebody willing to buy this piece of gear if you're interested in participating in the market. If you just happen to find it, go ahead and toss it into your stash, because you never know when you might want to try a different build that might care about those stats. So now that we understand rare pieces of gear, legendary pieces of gear, greater affixes, let's go ahead and talk about tempering. Tempering is a new system in this season, and it's available in the Eternal Realm as well, that allows you to add on 2 additional stats to ancestral legendary pieces of gear. Remember, we don't really care about rare pieces of gear. If it's sacred, you can only add 1 stat to it, which is not a terrible idea. You should basically be tempering as you go to add on stats that you may need. But where do we get a temper? How do we even temper? What does tempering really mean? First off, let's go look at the UI for the tempering, which occurs at the blacksmith. Here at the blacksmith, under the tempering tab, you can add in a piece of gear, and let's just go ahead and use this sword. We'll continue to build up this sword through our journey. And you'll notice that you have different options for what you can temper onto a piece of gear. You can temper 2 different affixes. They have to be from different affix types. For the weapon, we have weapon affixes and offensive affixes. That makes sense, right? If we were to look at any other piece of gear, like this helmet, you'll notice that we have defensive and utility tempers. Now, why do they have these different sets of them? It's exactly equal to the kind of aspects that you can put on them. So for a piece of armor, you can always put a defensive aspect and a utility aspect. You can temper on a utility temper and a defensive temper. So we have our sword. I can pick a cool weapon temper, and I have a list of amazing tempers that can go on it. Now, which one you're going to choose is going to be based off of your build. I'm currently playing a blight build. So if I were to look through the different options here, I see that I have chance for blight projectiles to cast twice, literally doubling how often the blight will happen. That seems pretty cool to me. I'm going to go ahead and select that one. It's going to cost me a collection of materials. I'm not even super blasting. You can't see behind me right now. You get a lot of materials. For a long time, I was salvaging everything. Now I just sell everything because I need the gold. But by hitting temper, it's going to roll one of the random options here. So for this temper, there's only 3 different options. I might hit decompose, blight, or blight size. Let's just see what happens. We hit decompose explosion size. Let's just go ahead and say that that was good for our build. Let's just say we cared about that thing. But Mac, that all seems pretty awesome. Where do I find these tempers, and how do I know what tempers I have? Well, temper manuals are going to start dropping in the open world and in any content that you do. If you're in the Helltide, you can find tempers. If you're running dungeons, nightmare dungeons, if you're going through and just doing whisper caches, you can get tempers from all over the world. Similar to the glyphs, which you just kind of unlock once you walk into World Tier 3 as you're going around doing different content. You're basically going to unlock all the tempers as well. Again, going into your collections, going into the Codex of Power, you can see your tempering recipes. Different classes have different recipes. There's also generic recipes, and the recipes increase in rarity from magic, where the rolls are generally a little bit lower, rare, where they start to get pretty valuable, and then legendary, which are the strongest. After you drop a temper manual, you tend to not find that same temper manual again. Let's go ahead and finish off tempering this sword. Now that I've put a weapon temper onto it, you'll notice that the symbol has changed. This little circle of arrows means that we could re-roll the temper, and this is where we can begin to brick items. Bricking an item is taking it and making it so that it's no longer valuable for you, not that it just like goes away, but it doesn't hit the stats that you want. So let's go ahead and say I really hated this decompose explosion. I would go back in, I would select which temper I wanted to try to use, and I really want to hit chance for blight projectiles. So I'm going to re-roll it again. Looking in the UI, you'll notice that I have 5 attempts to re-roll tempers on this piece of gear at all. There's a maximum of 5 attempts. You can't reset it. There's nothing that you can find that will like remove your tempers. You only ever have this many re-rolls to get lucky and get the stat that you want. So we click it again, and you'll notice I got blight size. Okay, not quite what I was looking for here. Again, I'm going to select it. Got blight size again, not really liking that. You'll notice that this is significantly different from the re-rolling of stats at the occultist, you can't choose to keep the previous temper roll that you had. That means that you might just get unlucky. I only got 2 more options. Ooh, maybe. Okay, one more time. And we ended up with Blight Size. Now, this is not the temper that I wanted, but you'll notice that it still relates to Blight. If I'm a Blight build, maybe Blight Size is still generally good for my build, or maybe it's just kind of okay enough for my build, where I wouldn't mind using this as a transitionary piece of gear. But I don't get to reroll this anymore. And what that means is when I go to put an offensive temper onto this piece of gear, I gotta kind of just get lucky right off the bat. I'm going to personally use the Shadow Finesse, which both the darkness damage and the shadow damage over time would both be good outcomes for me here. Corpse Explosion damage would be okay, and Desecrated Ground wouldn't help me at all. But I'm going to go ahead and put this onto my piece of gear, and what did we get? Corpse Explosion damage with a pretty decently high roll. Now I am using Corpse Explosion, so now I have a thing that says my Blight is slightly better, and my Corpse Explosion is going to do more damage. Is this a perfect piece of gear for me? No, but it might be, again, good enough for you to use in the interim. But there's absolutely a world where you're going to find a perfect 3 greater affix weapon and try to temper it and just get really unlucky and get screwed over. A lot of people have been giving feedback about this system. I personally think that's okay if there are ways for gear to be removed from the ecosystem. And this is by far one of the more tame versions of bricking that I've seen in an ARPG, but it's definitely leaving a bad taste in some people's mouths. Feel free to share your feedback. Let me know down in the comments if you've gotten screwed over. But let's go ahead and continue on with this piece of gear's journey. We have one last stop, and you may have noticed that I never really talked about upgrading. Upgrading was something that you used to be able to do. You'd get a piece of gear, you would upgrade it 5 times, and that would increase its stats by 50%, and you'd be done with your journey. That is completely gone. In fact, upgrading a piece of gear is now considered masterworking. Masterworking is going to be incredibly powerful for the end game and requires you to be doing the hardest content in the game, which is running the Pit of the Artificer. The Pit of the Artificer is this cool looking ornate box that has been added into Saragar, or Karagar rather. Karagar is up here in the north of your map in Skosglen, and when you click on this, nothing's going to happen at first. To be able to unlock the Pit of the Artificer, you actually need to run a tier 45 Nightmare Dungeon, which will then unlock the ability to go and do your first pit run. A pit is going to require something called a rune shard. That's this little material down here, rune shards. And you basically drop rune shards from every single piece of content in the game. But you have to have unlocked the pit before they start dropping. So remember, run a tier 45 Nightmare Dungeon, you'll get a priority quest in your quest book, which will say, come here and come touch this cool rock. And when you do that, you will be transcended, or transported rather, to a tier 1 Artificer run. Walking into the pit, you're now faced with a quick challenge. You have 15 minutes to complete the pit. To be able to do this, you have to go through and kill monsters. This is going to be very similar to a Greater Rift like in Diablo 3. Going through the pit very quickly, you will be killing monsters at the fastest rate that you possibly can. And after killing enough of them, you will actually open up a final boss room. Obviously, elite monsters are going to be worth more, trash monsters are worth less. You do need to be able to clear quickly, and a build that is able to run the pit efficiently needs to both be able to handle large densities of monsters, as well as being able to kill a large boss at the end. But as you can see, we have our Guardian's Lair town portal here. We walk in, and we have a boss. I'm going to kind of just stick around for a hot second so you can see the shadow boss effects as well. That's not what I'm talking about. This man just loves to go invisible. Let's see if he will spawn one. There we go. So this red circle comes out. We now have this big man who's chasing us down, who's going to spit out a bunch of little red circles of damage over time. And if you manage to kill the boss very quickly, it will end. All of the shadow bosses will go away. You will get all of your gear, which can also have greater affixes on it. You'll see that little star right there on that piece of gear. Let me go ahead and drop something so I can pick these up. And when you open up your mystery chest, you will now drop something called Obducite. Obducite is the first tier of crafting materials which are required to be able to masterwork your gear. On the higher tiers, so in tier 31 and higher, you'll get Ingolith, and then in tier 61 and higher, you'll get Neath Iron. And these are the materials that are needed to masterwork. So masterworking is considered an extremely end game process by which you continue to empower your gear to run higher tier pit. And just to give you an idea, if you've seen it previously, the Abattoir of Zir, back in the day, a tier 25 Abattoir of Zir, which was considered unclearable up until a couple ridiculously overpowered builds were able to walk in there. is roughly equivalent to a tier 150 pit. There are 200 levels in the pit, and the developers have effectively said they don't expect anyone to ever clear a tier 200 at our current power level. Let's go ahead and get back to our amazing swords journey here to figure out what do we even do with these materials. So back here at the blacksmith, I'm going to go to the Masterworking tab, which again will not be unlocked until you have successfully run the pit. And I'm going to put my sword in here. How does this work? Well, there's going to be a gold cost, there's going to be a resource cost, most notably including the materials that we just got from the pit, which are going to increase all of the affixes on this piece of gear by 5%. So I currently have 270 intelligence here. 5% of 270 is somewhere around 13. So when I click this button, I now have, oh, it was 9. I now have 279 intelligence. Now you may notice that some of the numbers on this piece of gear didn't increase. Masterworking will increase all of your affixes by that percentage, but you always have to hit a new full integer. So because we have 3 essence on kill, adding 5% to 3 gets you a whopping, what is that? A 3.15. That's not a lot. So again, you have to hit a full integer on a piece of gear before it will increase that value. You'll notice I have something like Black River, and Black River normally rolls with 2 for hewed flesh here. And that little blue number is a Masterwork crit. Now to be able to crit on this, you have to Masterwork 4 times. You can Masterwork up to 12 times, and every 4 you will crit. A crit will add 25% to that stat as opposed to just the 5% normal. But to be able to do this, I'm obviously going to need more materials because I've already run out of Obdicite. Running higher pit tiers within that range, so 1 to 30 for Obdicite, will get you more and more of the materials. But let's say you have a bunch of the later game materials and you don't want to go back and run the lower pit. You can luckily go over to the Alchemist and transmute your crafting materials. There's a bunch of different options here. You'll notice that I can make a bunch of small Obdicite caches. I'm just going to make enough so that I can actually finish off this example for you. It does come along with a large gold cost. And in general, people are also kind of just like generally upset at how much this gold cost is, but we're going to kind of ignore that for right now. So opening up your Obdicite caches will get you some Obdicite. You just got to run over them, bada boom, and we're right back to masterworking this. So hitting this button 2 more times, 1 and 2 will play a cool animation. You can hover over this earlier if you want to, and you'll notice that we now have blue essence on kill. We have successfully crit on essence per kill, increasing its total from 3 up to 4, and bada boom, we have our first Masterwork crit. Continuing to Masterwork this item further will now require the higher tier rarity of materials. So pit 31 to 60 will drop Ingolith. Continuing to Masterwork through here will have increasing costs, and this will lead all the way up to Neath Iron. Neath Iron is the legendary material, which you obtain by running 61 plus pit tiers. And this is obviously going to be the end game need for every single player, although I spend my time mostly getting the first 2 materials so I can continue masterworking. A masterwork piece of gear, like you can see across my build here, will have the initial bubbles. The little yellow bubbles indicate that it's been masterworked 4 times. Then you get these little yellow carrots that indicate that you're on the 2nd tier of masterworking, so on and so forth. You can masterwork unique items. You can masterwork legendary items, and adding onto their stats is going to be the best way to like fully empower a character's build. You'll also notice every single time that we masterwork it, it also increases the tempered stats. So all of a sudden I now have 200 additive damage for Corpse Explosion just from this one weapon. Something I should have pointed out a little bit earlier is that 2-handed weapons will have a 2 times bonus on the temper effects added to it. So this would be twice as strong as if you had put it onto a 1-handed weapon, but there's nothing stopping you from tempering both a 1-handed weapon and a 1-handed offhand if you're a character that can use multiple items like that. So great, I now have this big 2-handed weapon that had a greater affix. I've successfully masterworked it. I got a crit. I got some tempering affixes that I liked. That's all well and good. What a lot of people have been asking me though is what's the most efficient way to go about crafting a piece of gear? If tempering can brick it, do I really want to do anything else before I get there? What about re-rolling at the occultist? What if I can never get the stat that I want? While there isn't a sure, fireproof, or foolproof way of going about doing this, I think that there's one general approach to making a new piece of gear and crafting on it that will save you the most amount of heartache and headache when you inevitably don't get lucky on every single piece of gear. So let's use this other piece of gear that has a greater affix on it just as an example. I have a greater affix on life per second. It's not very good, but hey, let's say in this example I want it. I have maximum resource, and I have thorns. Well, I'm playing a thorns golem build, so I need that life per second to be able to survive, as well as for my minions, and I like the thorns damage, but I don't like that maximum resource. Before I would do anything, I would probably re-roll that, right? No, we want to go ahead and temper this piece of gear. The reason why tempering is ultimately the first thing that you should do to a piece of gear, it's because everything else, given enough resources, can be reset. You'll notice in the Masterworking screen, I have this Reset Masterwork Ranks button. This will come along with an additional cost of resources and gold, but let's say I hated that I hit maximum essence here. If I click confirm, it's like nothing ever happened. You start back at rank 0. You have to respend the materials to be able to continue to masterwork on it. You are not refunded any of the materials, but your item is not bricked. You can continue to masterwork on this to try to hit a crit on the stat that you want. And remember, there's nothing stopping you from critting on the same stat 3 times. So I could actually get 3 crits on maximum intelligence here and roll this thing to the moon for stats if that's what I was looking for. Because of this, tempering is absolutely the first thing that you should do. For the Necromancer, basically everybody is looking to solve a couple different problems, maxing out resistances, maxing out armor, and then ultimately getting temper rolls that are valuable for them from utility. One of the great examples here is Profane Initiative. This can increase corpse tendril size, it can increase Decrepify size, and vastly improves the quality of life of playing, especially on a controller for somebody like me. So I end up re-rolling this temper the most because just about everything else that you'll get from a defensive stat is probably good enough. So I would start off by tempering here. And let's say I just got lucky and I wanted to use Iron Maiden. Great. Now I know I don't have to worry about this thing anymore. I can go and try and roll my defensive stats here. So in this case, I want maximum life from Worldly Endurance. I would go ahead and toss that on. But I only hit dodge chance. This would give me the opportunity to continue to re-roll this whenever I needed it, and boom, I hit maximum life. Now it is a minimum roll. I could continue to roll this if I wanted to, or I could just cut my losses. At this point though, I have leapt over the only hurdle to this item being valuable for my build. I can't brick it at this point. I can go re-roll it at the Occultist for a stat that I really want. And luckily they have capped the total enchanting cost for this. So let's say again, I just really hated maximum resource and I didn't find the stat that I wanted, whatever it is. You would go through, and you would inevitably hit a point. I think for helmets, it's somewhere around like 2 million gold, where the cost will never improve from that point. It will never go higher. You are at a total maximum investment of resources that are required to make this. So given enough gold, given enough Angel Breath, and given enough Veiled Crystals, I will eventually hit the stat that I want here. Likewise, after I've successfully tempered this piece of gear twice and I'm able to masterwork it, given enough Obdicite, Ingolith, and Neath Iron, given enough gold, I will eventually get the crits that I want on this if I'm willing to continue to grind. So as such, the way to go absolutely is temper first, then re-roll the piece of gear to make sure that you get the stat that you want. And then at that point, I would go and imprint it with your aspect. There's no reason to imprint it earlier because you might brick this item. And if you never hit the stat that you want, you'll never end up using the piece of gear. So it'll just sit in your stash while you go out and get more resources. That's when I would put on the aspect. And that's when I would start masterworking in those steps. Temper, reroll, aspect, masterwork. Oh, and obviously at some point you would socket it and put a gem into it. There you go. I think that that's basically a pretty comprehensive guide for how all of these new systems work, in addition to how they kind of fit into the natural progression of the systems that we had previously. Let me know down in the comments if you had any questions, concerns, ideas, if there's something that wasn't clear, if you just kind of wanted to hang around and talk. I generally respond to every single comment down there. If you enjoyed this video, if you came along and this is your first time seeing the channel, consider subscribing as well. It would help me out a ton. As well, if you wouldn't mind dropping a like onto the video, that'd be great too. Thank you so much for watching this video. I truly hope that it helps you jump into season 4 with as much information as possible. And as always, I look forward to seeing you in the next one.